We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that you really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelming on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Just a heads up before we begin. My entire discussion with Feargus is available on Rumble, X, and podcast platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Due to certain controversial topics discussed and trying not to get in trouble on this platform, we have to cut off part of this discussion. Welcome to Palisade's Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Bodrovics. Joining me today is Feargus O'Connor Greenwood, author of 180 Degrees, Unlearn the Lies That You've Been Taught to Believe. Feargus, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks very much for the invite, Tom. I'm pleased to be here.
So this is going to be a little bit of a departure from our normal type of interview. Obviously, we're going to talk a lot today about the financial system, about really interpreting and trying to understand events as they happen. And obviously, with the election coming up, that's going to be very important. But again, a lot of today's conversation is going to focus around really changing our thinking and our understanding about what happens, who's behind it, let's say, and even how to communicate a lot of those things to those around us. So, Feargus, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about the book, kind of how you came to feel compelled to write a book of this particular subject and what drew you to this?
And I suppose I recognize the fact that we're being lied to, not just about the small things, but the big things, and not just some things, but pretty much everything. So the aim of the book really was sort of threefold in a certain way. One, exposing the deception, sort of shining a light on how people are being manipulated is often the best defense against being manipulated in the future. Breaking the spell, probably the biggest one that's been cast over us all, and that is the spell of belief in authority, or the refusal of many people to believe that people in power wish them harm. I think that's probably one of the biggest things to try and get through. And I'm happy to say from the feedback I've got so far, that seems to have been the case with the book in helping people. And third, communication. So not only making sure it's a really easy read and the flow's there, but in turn giving people the tools of how to communicate the truth to others without alienating them. And you're probably familiar with the term Hanlon's razor, which is never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. Well, I've got a sharper razor for you, Tom, and it's this. Don't attribute to incompetence that which is better explained by psychopathy.
I would totally agree. That's a better and sharper razor, and one that I think explains, many of the, let's say, incentives behind many of the, let's say, systems of control that we're now, subject to, really. I love one of the quotes from Socrates, and you have a ton of excellent and really interesting quotes through the book. And just for some context, the book is almost 800 pages, but you've had some people that aren't even book readers get sucked into it and get through it in about 2 weeks. But the quote was, "I can't teach anyone, I can only make them think." And that was by Socrates. And I think that's really the essence of why I find this book so interesting. And really what I aim to do with this podcast is just help people to think differently about basically, obviously, the financial system, because that's what a lot of the show is focused on. When it comes to understanding the financial system, do you think a good place to kind of start is to help people to understand that it's not there to help them prosper, earn interest, and let's say save over time?
I would say the best place to start in trying to explain, because I think we've got some issues with the financial system, but we've got a much bigger issue, fundamental issue with the monetary system. And I think a lot of complexity that's been introduced into the financial system is there to cover up for an absolutely simple and fundamental truth, which is money is created out of nothing and then having interest charged on it.
Mhm.
So in the book, I start with basically three questions. What is money? Where does it come from? And how is it created? And you'd think, well, we all deal with money all day long. This would be really easy to answer. Now, I guess that your audience has got a much higher percentage chance of answering all those three questions because of the topics you've covered and the people you've had on.
Mm.
But I would say if you go to most people in the street, no one can answer all three of them. So if we look at what is money, I say the best way of explaining it is to split it into its functions and its attributes. So its functions are, it's a medium of exchange, i.e. it needs to be acceptable. It needs to be a unit of account, i.e. it needs to act as a measure. And it also needs to be a store of wealth, i.e. in theory can protect your purchasing power over time. So that's its functions. But as well as the functions, it has a load of attributes. And those are divisible, durable, fungible, portable, inert, tangible, anonymous, finite, has intrinsic value, and no counterparty risk. So I'd say if you want to decide whether something is money, it's best to ask two distinct questions. Number one, is it money? I.e., is it an acceptable medium of exchange? Or is it good money? Does it possess all or most of the value characteristics you're after? And of course, if we look at the fiat currency system and the attributes there, obviously it doesn't fulfill all of them because, it's not finite. It doesn't have any intrinsic value and there is counterparty risk. And I mean, we'll probably get on to Bitcoin talking about that as well. But people say, well, is it currency? Is it not currency? So, well, you can decide for yourself by going down the list. But it pretty much ticks the same number of boxes that fiat currency does. And so, in my mind, absolutely, it's a currency. Although if you really dig into the crypto space, the argument from Andreas Antonopoulos is it's not just currency, it's a platform of trust. And if you understand where we are on the trust levels that are going on at the moment, that could be quite useful. As for where does it come from? Well, only 2 to 3% is physical cash, and 97% of the rest is created as debt. But it's perhaps how it is created, which is, it's sort of a simplicity, but some would say the audacity is it's just created out of thin air. And I wanted to do in the book, because the temptation is to get into fractional reserve banking, trying to explain this, that, and the other. And I thought for the layperson, they don't want any of that. They just want an absolute laser focus on the core point. And I think that's it. So I used a brief conversation that G. Edward Griffin had with in one podcast. And I love this because the whole book, I've tried to, what I call the vector of attack. So what's the best way to come at this whole subject matter that's going to make it easiest for people to understand? And when I heard this, I went, this is brilliant. So this is a conversation between a bank auditor and G. Edward Griffin, the author, as you all know, a creature from Jekyll Island. Mm-hmm. So the bank auditor says this: well, you don't really understand the complexities of money because money is not really just created at all, because you can't just create something. For every asset, you have to have a liability. Griffin says, well, I know that, but they create them both at the same time. Bank auditor, oh, no, they don't do that. No, I audit the books. This is my business. I know what's going on. Griffin received a letter from the same auditor a week later saying this: you got me thinking. I went back and analysed it. I hate to admit it, but you were right. Yeah, we do make it out of nothing. And you go in, hang on, how is it that this system runs and even the people who are meant to be checking the banks don't even know how the system works? Now, we got the empirical proof of that courtesy of Richard A. Werner, and he did that, I think, in the International Review of Financial Analysis in 2014. And there's a quote from that says, money was borrowed from a cooperating bank while its internal records were being monitored. This study establishes for the first time empirically that banks individually create money out of nothing. The money supply is created as fairy dust produced by the banks individually out of thin air. And just to finish off, there's a quote from John Titus, and I think he nails it because he says, when I lend you $1,000, I'm charging you interest because I don't have possession of that $1,000 anymore. Fair enough. That's not the case with commercial banks. The bank is charging you interest on something that did not exist. That is not interest. That is a tax.
I mean, I don't even know where to start there, Feargus.
Well, I mean, there's not that much to discuss in terms of basically that is the problem with, if you're looking at why we've got so many problems in the world, that's it. Because if you can create infinite money out of thin air, you get infinite bribes.
Exactly.
And if you've got infinite bribes, you've got infinite corruption and control. And of course, that's why it's been introduced. But I mean, it came in, this system has been running for a long time. At least since 1694 when the Bank of England was created, which of course was a private institution, just like the Fed is. But the implications of this are things like we have overt taxation where you have income tax and sales tax, like over here, VAT. Overt but disguised taxation, that's interest charges on, that's your money renting, as it were. And covert taxation is inflation, which generally most people accept is an increase in the money supply. So the point is, if I gave you, Tom, the license and you were the only person in the world allowed to create money out of nothing and charge everyone else in the world on interest, guess what happens next? You end up owning everything. Mm-hmm. If you live long enough, because it's a function of interest and time. Mm-hmm. So I think you can talk about all the other issues in the financial system and what's going on, the corruption and everything else. But if we don't change the fundamentals of money, then you're not going to change anything.
Absolutely. And I think, I was having a discussion with a friend about kind of what ends up being, let's say, one of the first order causes of many of the problems that we're seeing in the world. And yeah, I think that comes back. My answer actually was many of these issues come back to this flawed monetary system that we have. When you have, as you said, this ability to print unlimited dollars and or bribes, that perverts the free market, as it were, and all of the incentives associated with operating any kind of offering to that market. And I think, as Austrians, they want a return to this free market idea. And I think ultimately that would be, I think, the best solution to all of it is to fix the money. And I think that in turn fixes many of these incentives, which drive a lot of, again, the problems that we've seen develop over, centuries now.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for the Austrian school and, solid money and everything else, because, of course, things like the Cantillon effect come into play, where if you get the money first, you get all the benefit. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it solves the problem completely, mainly because there's another factor which we tend to forget about, and that's the human factor. And that comes in under the blackmail category, because we all think we live in democracy or republic, but when you take, the lid off the can and look in, the whole thing runs on blackmail and corruption. So we've got, for example, in the UK, we've had, for example, back in the day from Ken Livingstone saying, I was raising in Parliament against Mrs. Thatcher Kincora Boys Home, where boys were being abused, and MI5 was filming it because they're hoping to be able to blackmail senior politicians. Jennifer Curry, who was Boris Johnson's partner, said, you can believe me now or find out later, that man Boris entered office blackmailed and compromised. And this goes on and on and on. I mean, Andrew Bridgen recently said, they tried to bribe me. They said, you could have anything you want, just shut up about talking about the shoulder taps. So I think the money goes hand in hand with some of that stuff, and it gets far, far darker than just basic bribery, you know, which I'll try and save your channel, Tom, by not maybe dipping into at this point.
Well, I appreciate that, Feargus. And I mean, you do go through that in the book, and people can make those extrapolations as they will. But I think maybe a useful place to go back to is talking a little bit about, let's say, monetary history and what can happen when one entity has control of, let's say, expanding and then contracting the currency supply. I don't want to call it money. I want to be very deliberate about making that delineation. So what was done and what did it result in when there was big contractions in the money supply after a big expansion?
Okay, so there's 3 dates I would draw people's attention to, and that's 1832, 1929, and 2008. Because when, you know, we live, you know, 60, 80 years, whatever, I'm guessing there's very few of your listeners who were born before 1929. So, whilst we've all probably read up on some of the shenanigans around then, I mean, what I try and show in the book is how they deliberately cut the money supply in 1929 in order to induce what came afterwards, which was the Great Depression. And that's not just me saying that, that's Milton Friedman, I believe, who said it, and even Ben Bernanke, in rather jocular fashion, said it. But it's true. He said, well, we cut the money supply by a third, and that's what caused the Great Depression. I don't think it's the only thing that caused the Great Depression, because I think there's a saying that the only way of not having a boom, the only way of not having a bust is not to have the boom in the first place, which I have a lot of sympathy for. I think, I don't know if that was Keynes or someone else who said it. But if you look back, particularly around 1832 and when Jackson was president, he had a big fight with the second central bank of the US, and the guy running that was called Nicholas Biddle. And Biddle basically did the same thing then. They didn't want to hand... Basically, Jackson was going to stand in the election on Jackson and no bank. And he was saying, hang on, these people aren't helping, they're hindering. So there was a big pull and push between the two of them. Biddle tried to restrict the monetary supply. Businesses were hurting desperately. The bank tried to blame Jackson. Jackson had nothing to do with it. He was just standing his ground against the banks. And eventually, Jackson won, and the central bank was dismantled. And guess what? 3 years later, the US got out of all its debt. So the point is, you start joining the dots on these points in history and realise that it's not just an organic phenomenon. I believe there's people pulling the strings to make it worse than it needs to be.
Mm-hmm. And of course, these depressions aren't an act of God, right?
No, I think, as I said already, I mean, if you have a massive boom, you know, it's not that surprising that you have a bust. But, you know, if your firemen, if the people who turn up and the firemen start trying to burn your house down, then you're not going to get the result you thought you were going to.
So going back to, let's say, the subject of central banks, where did they come from and who do they ultimately benefit?
Where did we come from? Good question. I mean, I didn't go back as far as the Medici and all that type of thing. I tended to start at the Bank of England and work my way forward from there, focusing on the formation of the Federal Reserve. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Federal Reserve is probably the best case study to understand what's going on because, of course, it was basically a banking cartel who wanted basically to get more control of the monetary system and went about that by inducing a financial panic, I think in 1907, and in order to try and push through what eventually became the Federal Reserve Act, which was signed, I think, Christmas 2012, was it? Beginning 2013. I might have my Christmases wrong there, but what they did was... Sorry?
1912, right? You said
Christmas 1912, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. So, what they did was they stood a candidate, I think the Bull Moose Party candidate, on the right to split the vote, and then groomed, Woodrow Wilson, the guy on the left, in order to come through. But he was completely controlled by a guy called Colonel Edward Mandell House and a guy called Baruch, who was one of the key bankers at the time. And I think it was Curtis Dahl who said in his book, Wilson was sort of brought into a room like a poodle on a leash. And even Wilson, I think, said, mine and House's mind are one. So I think it became a bit of a joke about who was making the decisions. So, how do you get an act through that is supposedly, anti-banking? Well, you set it up, make it look like that's what it is, when in fact doing the opposite. So there you have your classic inversion again. Everyone was cheering on, I think, the Federal Reserve Act because it'd been sold as a way of controlling the banks and avoiding financial crashes, when in fact the opposite was true. And what they were really doing was making sure it was a cartel, and then they could have a field day with it all. And we're still suffering the consequences of that decision, Tom.
Mm-hmm. Well, you brought up something that I want to make a little bit more explicit, Feargus, and that's this idea of understanding what they're telling you, and in a lot of cases, needing to believe the exact inverse. Like, let's take the idea of savings and gaining interest. When you look at the real rate of exchange, let's say especially over the past 4 years, if you're leaving money in a bank account and your banker, let's say, tells you that you can earn interest and benefit from that, your real rate of return ends up actually still being negative.
Yeah. And for the main reason is that the real rate of inflation is a lot higher than what they're telling you. I think you had John Williams from Shadow Stats on, did you recently, or am I wrong?
Yep. Yeah, twice actually.
Yeah, okay, great. So John's been following, I think he has methodologies based on how they calculated it in 1980 and how that's what the real rate of inflation should be compared to what they're telling you. And, I think he's had it running at least 10%. I mean, it's one of those where they'll tell you X and then you'll go into a supermarket and go, hang on, that's just doubled in price or shrunk in half with the shrinkflation. And it's a big problem because this, again, is another function of the monetary system as we have it, in that if you run this system long enough over time, then, I think I said in the book, you cannot save your way to getting rich, not in that type of system. Now, obviously, saving money rather than spending it is going to help you. But you've got to look at different avenues. And I think this is where obviously gold, silver and crypto come in. I mean, probably the best wealth preservation asset you could have been in over the last 10 or 15 years is Bitcoin, providing that you didn't get it nicked in the Mt. Gox debacle. But, I mean, we're all still waiting for gold and silver to do their thing, particularly silver. At least gold is hitting new all-time highs. And, I mean, personally speaking, I've been gold and silver since 2006 and crypto for the last 10 years, because I think the only safe havens are tangible assets, because they're probably going to inflate this like they did in Weimar Republic, so we can just wipe out all the debt through hyperinflation. So, I mean, I'm hoping that silver's going to move before I actually die, Tom. I think if I put my neck on the line, I think we're going to see it happen in the next 12 months or so.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure there's a lot of listeners and a lot of people maybe that aren't fans of the show, let's say, that feel the same and hope they see that before they die or before you die as well, Feargus. But
I mean, we have been waiting a long time, right? I mean, the whole narrative has been it's going to the moon, and that's not just crypto, but generally silver. But I mean, the silver situation is just a joke. I mean, name me one asset, possibly apart from electronics, if you want to play around that area, that is still at half its all-time high from 1980. Mm-hmm. I mean, even gold's made it past there, like, come on, silver. But that's just another example of manipulation. And I'm sure you and your listeners are all too familiar with how that's done with commitment of traders report. And again, we're back to the same problem. If you can create contracts and as many as possible out of thin air that you can sell, then you can put the price anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, again, comes back to this idea of incentives. And it's not necessarily that the people that are executing, let's say, those shorts or those contracts on a daily basis, it's not necessarily that they're malicious or even intentional about that particular end state of the price, but it's more so the system that attracts that type of and allows that type of behavior, I think.
Yeah, I think there's an element of truth in all that. I mean, what I would say is, look, this can't be done forever. I mean, we've been here before. They tried to do it with the gold standard in the States in the 60s. It started cracking up massively. And then, we had 1971 onwards and a huge bull run in both the metals. I think with the use now with all the solar panels, both India and China's demand has gone through the roof. All this new demand is on top of what was before. And we're talking 3 or 4 million ounces here. We're not talking on a market size of 800 million to 1 billion ounces. At some point, the physical will destroy the paper market. And at that point, we're going to see a big price move, I believe. And I'd be very surprised if it's not in the next 12 months.
Mm-hmm. So why do you feel like it's going to be in the next 12 months, Feargus?
So I think all the signs are there that they're not going to be able to keep this price down. And that is, as I say, the physical demand more than anything. Now, we know in the paper market, they can keep the price whatever level they want if you can create infinite contracts, as just mentioned. Mm-hmm. But if you need the delivery of the physical metal and it's not there, that's when the market breaks. And I can see a time where there's no bid, no offer, and we won't have any idea what the price is on either of them. But on the other side of that, I mean, they often say, I think Bob Moriarty on repeating the old phrase, gold isn't investment, it's insurance. Well, I think we're about to go and hit crazy town in the next 2 months, and that might add some added pressures. So it's just a personal view, but I think there's enough factors there showing that they're not going to be able to hold this much longer.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's certainly something that I've talked to a lot of guests about, is this idea of the actual physical delivery and what that ends up meaning for the markets. And once that ends up really being called into question, that can have just incredible reverberations through all of the markets, right?
Yeah, because one of the problems is it's like a beach ball being held underwater. I mean, it's a simple analogy, it's probably been used before. But, once you stop pushing it downwards, it suddenly doesn't just rise to the surface, it springs up and goes way above the water. So I think we're going to get one of those moments, would be my guess.
Mm-hmm. So one of the subjects that I wanted to just touch on, kind of to tie up the loose end, we talked about the Fed and the creation of the Fed, the control that it ends up giving them. What about the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements? Is that very much in the same boat, but just at a more multinational level?
Yeah. So you've got central banks, and as most of your listeners will know, the B.I.S. is the central bank of central banks. So it's just one of those cases where, the cake's been over-egged just that little bit more. So, yeah, it goes back. I mean, it nearly got disbanded in the early 30s for nefarious activities. But yeah, I would direct people to the book Tragedy and Hope by Carroll Quigley, written in 1966. And he nails it in that, saying the central bank of central banks, B.I.S., was there to be able to control not only the other banks, but also the governments of the world.
And what is that system of control? How does that end up happening to be able to control governments by, let's say, by currency?
Well, we've got various different ways, but the first one I'd direct you to is back to the bribery again. I mean, the problem is, as far as I can see in the West, none of the politicians are really representing the view of the people. And when you dig down into the blackmail, you can see why. And my view is you're not allowed to get into that position unless you're compromised. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't really matter what the machinations of the finances in the background. If you've got some really heinous video footage of a politician doing something they shouldn't, it doesn't matter then what other control mechanisms are there. They're going to do everything they can to make sure that footage isn't shown. Mm-hmm. You have to think of your government a bit like a mafia organisation. And with those, it tends to be blood in, blood out, meaning that because you're dealing with a set of psychopaths, most psychopaths know they individually can't be trusted, and therefore no one else can. And therefore what they want is the maximum leverage in terms of blackmail material against the politicians so that they don't have any choice but to comply to keep them wandering off the reservation. I would say that usurps every other form of monetary control.
Mm-hmm. So, Feargus, let's move on to possible solutions. What are some of the, let's say, the better forms of money? And maybe we can start by explaining it through the analogy of, let's say, Bitcoin versus a gun.
Okay. I presume you don't want me to shoot everyone. Well, whenever I say with the gun analogy is a gun is a technology. So I don't view it as either good or bad. It can be used for good or it can be used for bad. It can be used for protecting people from being killed, or it can be involved in a brutal act of wanton slaughter. So for me, the gun's the gun. The problem is whoever's on the end of it or not. Mm-hmm. And I think this is one of the ways to look at Bitcoin is, you get a lot of polarization here because people want to choose A or B. They don't want to choose A and B. Mm-hmm. So nearly everyone gets involved in this binary thinking of well, that's good or it's bad. And it's like, well, no, in the case of Bitcoin, I would say, or let's say cryptocurrency in general, well, it can be both, in my view. The worst form of it is CBDCs, the central bank digital currency that they're trying to push forward at the moment, because that's a centralized system where they can control everything you ever do. We won't let you spend outside 15 minutes of where you live. You'll just be switched off. I made the joke that in China, in theory, you could now get fined for jaywalking and have the fine taken from your account before you've actually crossed the road. So I think with Bitcoin, or crypto, you've got both. And I would say a proper decentralized cryptocurrency that it certainly isn't centrally controlled, brings freedom, And the centralized versions, that's going to bring the ultimate tyranny. Mm-hmm. So it's not a question of whether crypto is good or bad. It's like, well, which crypto and how is it formulated? And I think most people come to a different conclusion. Yeah, okay. So one of the problems is people tend to get stuck in binary thinking. Things, they either choose A or B rather than looking at the situation as A and B. And quite often, A and B will explain the situation better than A or B. So we can apply the idea of sort of that with reference to what we just talked about, the gun, in that gun's just a technology, and it's the same with Bitcoin. It's neither good nor bad, in my opinion. It's like, well, who's at the end of it and what they're doing with it? And there's a huge difference between, for example, centralized cryptocurrency, which is what they're trying to do with the CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, which are basically would ensure our absolute enslavement as a species, in my opinion, versus a proper decentralized currency that the people have control over. And that, for me, would give us a lot more freedom than what the current system offers. And I think the way of viewing all gold, silver, and crypto is to view it as all anti-fiat. It's an alternative to fiat currency. And the danger is, at the moment, is that fiat currency is going to be trashed. And therefore, you would be best in asset classes that aren't ruled by that. I mean, obviously, they're sort of priced in it currently, but they will retain value on the other side. Now, for anyone who is still skeptical about the Bitcoin thing, I would say, well, take it away from the headlines and just look at what fiat currency offers versus what crypto offers. And if we look at the fiat currency system, you currently have middlemen, which means you've got added cost in the system. You need permission to send your money, so it's a third-party approval. You have capital controls, restrictions over international borders. It can be subject to confiscation. The ownership is a huge thing because, as you probably know, Tom, if you put your money in a bank, it may still be your asset, but it's no longer your property. Basically, the money in your account is owned by the bank until you demand it back. All money at the moment is basically debt. The current system's exclusive, infinite, and public. Now, and slow and inflationary. Now, if we look at crypto, I'm going to just take Bitcoin in this case, it's trustless. It means it doesn't need trust in a human being to operate it. There's no middlemen. You don't need a bank. It's permissionless, circumnavigates third-party approval. It's borderless, so you don't have the capital controls. Very difficult to confiscate. It's equity-based. It's more inclusive. It's finite, private, quick, arguably deflationary, and censorship resistant. Now, if you look at all the qualities that it offers versus the fiat system, I can't imagine there's many people on the planet who wouldn't go, I want that one.
Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about that, Feargus, many people will level the accusation that, Bitcoin was maybe devised by the CIA to take, maybe liquidity from gold and silver. How do you see the origination of Bitcoin as playing into the trustless or trustable nature of that particular cryptocurrency?
Yeah, well, it's a very good point. I mean, I've heard all the different stories. I think the best answer to that is given by Andreas Antonopoulos, and he used the example of Euclidean geometry. And he says, well, we don't need to know whether Euclid was a good person or an evil person. Mm-hmm. All we need to know is, does it work? And he said, you can do the same with Bitcoin because you can see everything that's going on. Now, I would agree, and I have pointed out before and in the book, that the origination is an issue in that there should be more clarity around it. Is it the deep state or more a team of people wanting to fight against the current system? I mean, the truthful answer is I don't know. I think you need to be wary of things like, I think people pick up on the NSA thing because it uses a SHA-256 as an encryption technology. But that's the best out there. And as far as I'm aware, it hasn't been broken by anyone. And someone explained it to me in detail as why it was so effective. So just because a technology has emanated from, say, the NSA, doesn't automatically mean they control the whole of Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. That is just the encryption part. And unless someone can show that it's actually been broken, then I don't think it's as big a problem as people are making out. But I think one of the bigger problems with Bitcoin is the concentration of large amounts of Bitcoin in a few hands, because in a perfect system, you'd have a better distribution on that.
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to move on, Feargus, if we could, to kind of applying more of the framework, more of the useful framework that's in the book to how we think about things. I think one of the really interesting ways that you have of describing something is, rather than trying to prove what did happen, is to understand a situation by proving what didn't happen. So maybe you could give us an example that comes to mind that illustrates that well, and then explain to us the thinking process to be able to understand it.
Yeah, so in very simple terms, what I understood, I mean, at the time I was looking at things like 9/11, and I could see a huge amount of arguments going on over the, minutiae of the situation. And I was thinking, well, this is ridiculous because you're arguing over tiny bits. And I realized, well, actually, the problem here is people trying to prove the absolute truth 100%. But it's the wrong target to go after, in my opinion, because proving the lie is a far lower bar to get over than proving exactly what happened. And once you've proven the lie, you've broken the spell. So, for example, we take something like 9/11, it contains the impossible. We have the BBC.
Due to various controversial topics discussed, the remainder of this interview is available on Rumble, X, and podcast platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I apologize for making you have to switch over to another platform, but unfortunately, it's the reality of the censorship that we're facing on this platform. This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.